Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gab am 9. Juni bekannt, deutsche Seestreitkräfte, darunter die beiden Schlachtschiffe Gneisenau und Scharnhorst, operierten unter Führung des Admirals Marschall im Nordmeer. Hierbei wurden verschiedene englische Einheiten vernichtet. Männer der Propagandakompanien begleiteten den Flottenverband und brachten jetzt diese Bilder von den siegreichen Kämpfen unserer Kriegsmarine in die Heimat zurück. Der deutsche Flottenverband läuft aus. Die Schlachtschiffe Gneisenau und Scharnhorst folgen einander in Kiellinie. Mit 26.000 Tonnen sind sie zurzeit unsere stärksten Schiffe. Je 9 28 cm Geschütze auf Drillingstürme verteilt sind ihre wirkungsvollsten Waffen. Eine Treibmine wird durch Flakbeschuss unschädlich gemacht. In der Warslinie geht es weiter vorwärts nach Norden. Aufklärer werden von den Schlachtschiffen katapultiert. Sie sind das Auge der Flotte über weiteste Räume. Durch Funkmeldung geben sie alle Beobachtungen bekannt, ehe sie noch von ihrem Unternehmen zurückkehren. Befehl an einen schweren Kreuzer. Entlassen für Sonderaufgabe. Inzwischen ist der englische Flugzeugträger Glorious gemeldet. Der 22.500 Tonnen große Koloss hat 48 Bombenflugzeuge an Bord. Mit äußerster Kraft geht es dem Feind entgegen, der durch Zerstörer gesichert wird. Die Beute ist erkannt. Unsere Schlachtschiffe eröffnen das Feuer auf die Glorious.
On the afternoon of the 8th of June, 1940, two German battlecruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, sighted a wisp of smoke on the Arctic horizon. 2 hours later, the carrier HMS Glorious and her two escorting destroyers, Ardent and Acasta, had been sunk. More than 1,500 lives were lost, qualifying the incident as one of the worst naval disasters of the Second World War. I have no personal link with the tragedy, but many of my constituents do. A cousin of mine was close by, serving as a rating in the escort party of the Norwegian royal family and the diplomatic corps as they embarked for the evacuation upon HMS Devonshire, which features in the story I am about to unfold. He was never able to tell me about these events, because he was lost with almost the entire complement of HMS Hood a year later. My constituent Mr. Sam Farrington lost his brother, who was only 17 when he went down with Glorious. Another constituent of mine was Captain Nick Barker, who died not long after retiring to Northumberland. He famously commanded HMS Endurance at the time of the Falklands War. He lost his father, Lieutenant Commander Ben Barker, who was in command of HMS Ardent. Nick's proud son produced a television program, which appeared in the Secret History series upon Channel 4. Those family members, and many others, have all written to me from all across the country, and they have convinced me that the official history of this tragedy needs to be revised to take account of what has subsequently come to light. For many years, those people have been deeply troubled by the belief that the loss of their loved ones have not been properly explained. Nobody is looking, after all these years, for blame or retribution, but where a supreme sacrifice has been made on such a scale, the record should surely be as accurate as possible, an unconvincing explanation produced in the conditions of war should no longer be given unchallenged official approval. These families have aroused the interest of several honorable members. The honorable member for Linlithgow, who is here, my honorable member for Winchester, and the honorable member for East Londonderry have all spoken or written to me. The Admiralty, and now the Ministry of Defense, have all maintained that the sinkings were merely an unfortunate accident of war. A significant number of naval historians, however, continue to suggest what the few survivors and relatives have long suspected, that a catalogue of errors and misjudgments have culminated in the tragic events of that afternoon. On the 8th of June, HMS Glorious and her 2 escorting destroyers were heading for Scapa Flow, having left the coast of northern Norway that morning. At about 1600, 2 German battleships were spotted on the starboard horizon. Unable to launch protective aircraft into the wind without turning towards the enemy, Glorious sent out her first radio signal at 16:15, fired up her boilers, which had since been shut down, and slowly increased to full speed in an attempt to run to the southeast. Shortly thereafter, one of the battle cruisers opened up with terrifying accuracy. Following several hits, the order to abandon ship was eventually given about at 17:20. Ardent was sunk at 17:28, and at 18:08 Acosta joined her. The bravery of the men of the doomed destroyers was later vividly praised by German crew members from the Scharnhorst. In the program, one was quoted as saying, quote, "Our flags flew at half-mast, and the whole bridge stood at attention due to the courage of the English sailors." End quote. Only 41 survivors were picked up after 2 days in the icy waters. 2 members of Parliament, who had suspected that the sinkings might not have been just a tragic accident, first expressed disquiet about the explanation of what had happened in this house on the summer of 1940. In 1946, when morale and security were no longer paramount with the war over, Labour MP Richard Stokes asked the First Lord of the Admiralty, quote, when the promised report upon the loss of HMS Glorious and her attendant destroyer will ever be published. End quote. Pressure was growing in the Admiralty for a full inquiry into the sinking, but in a memorandum that came to light many years later, R. Powell, head of the military branch, advised strongly against a detailed investigation, writing, quote, "A full report at this date would make a very dismal reading, and it would invite Mr. Stokes and other MPs to ask why this or that was not done." End quote. And yet we are still asking these questions 60 years later. The official account given by the Admiralty in Hansard on the 8th of May 1946 has remained almost altered to this day. It has been frequently criticized by naval historians and many officers for raising opinion and conjecture to the level of fact and for failing to give adequate explanation to the main areas of the controversy. Why was Glorious returning home independently of the main convoy? Why was she so poorly prepared? Why was her air power not even used for reconnaissance? Was there not sufficient intelligence about German activity in the region to suggest that Glorious should have been in no greater state of readiness? Could HMS Devonshire, who had been nearby, have helped the stricken vessel, or did its commander have no idea what's happening? These are the words from the House of Commons Speaker, Mr. A.J. Beath, in 1999, on the 28th of January, concerning an event that happened 60 years prior, that is, the sinking of HMS Glorious. What you heard at the start of the stream was a propaganda reel from the Kriegsmarine shortly after the Glorious was sunk by Scharnhorst. That commercial aired and actually displayed the footage. Of course, for reasons that might be obvious, I have elected not to show any such imagery. In fact, I've, after a good amount of consideration, elected to go without any such things as background music or any kind of imagery, as this is a story that, personally, I feel deserves a little bit of a more fitting atmosphere. HMS Glorious was a Courageous class converted aircraft carrier, one of 3. She served as a heavy cruiser in the First World War and then was converted into an aircraft carrier due to the limitations on the Washington Naval Treaty a few years later. She only made it less than a year into the First World War. Before we talk a little bit about the event itself, the reason that I had brought up the newsreel or the propaganda reel, and then later the reading of the defense case from the British Parliament, I wanted to talk about how that happened. Notably, there are a number of questions that Mr. Beath brought up. And unfortunately, the only conclusive answer is that anything that Parliament could say, or even the Royal Navy could officially produce, is that those answers are ultimately lost to time, at the bottom of the ocean with 1,500 other people. Many concur that the admiral aboard HMS Glorious, Mr. Admiral Guy Diolly Hughes, who was on board the aircraft carrier at the time, gave a number of questionable orders due to his very stringent personality. The truth of that, however, is contestable. It is true that HMS Glorious did not have any way to have spotted the two German battleships, and it is also true that both of her destroyer escorts did everything they could to make the aircraft carrier escape. However, as history shows, none of that ended up working out. So in order to find out the truth of this mystery, or at least lay the foundation for the truth to be found, I like to tell this story. It is the story of how one person altered the course of history for not just all the people involved, but everyone else around them. Let's wind back the clock to the 31st of May of the same year, 1940. It is a cold, cold afternoon in the northern shores near Narvik, Norway. Glorious, as well as HMS Ark Royal, had been traveling to Narvik with the explicit intention to pick up Allied troops. These troops were to protect the Norwegian royal family, who, just a few months earlier, had been attacked by the Kriegsmarine in another episode that we will talk about. As well as the royal family, there were a number of civilians from Oslo, the capital of Norway, and a whole lot of gold. This gold would be transferred to the Royal Navy through a vast series of operations, with this one being the first of them. Glorious, being a converted aircraft carrier as opposed to Ark Royal, a purpose-built aircraft carrier, was not actually meant to carry all of the troops that it was placed upon. However, those troops could not remain there, as it was plainly obvious that the Third Reich and all of the other Nazi forces would continue moving northwards. Of course, they could not hope to produce all of the things that they needed to conduct battle without the natural resources of Norway. Thus was both Glorious and Ark Royal set to return to the British port of Scapa Flow, where the home fleet and the main fleet of the Royal Navy lay waiting. However, Glorious was given leave to depart earlier than Ark Royal by nearly 2 days. The reason given was that Admiral Guy Diolly Hughes was to attempt a court-martial upon a captain. Mr. J.B. Heath, the commander of the air units aboard Glorious, had refused to do a task that Admiral Hughes had asked of him. The order was to carry out an attack on shore targets, but Mr. Heath had stated that the aircraft were not capable of performing such an attack, and that Admiral Hughes was not learned enough in the ways of aircraft to properly make that command. Of course, in the Royal Navy at the time, this would be considered high treason. Thus was the commander left at Scapa Flow, and Glorious was to return to the port and carry out the court-martial. Here's where things get a little strange. On the 8th of June, in the mid-afternoon, Glorious was steaming with her 2 destroyer escorts. Allegedly, British intelligence had no reason to believe that there would be any German surface ships anywhere near the area. What they did not know, however, was that the Kriegsmarine, 2 days prior, had launched what was called Operation Juno. The fast battleships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper were to sail from the southernmost point of Norway to the northernmost point in an effort to cut down on Allied shipments towards Russia and, of course, to Norway. Admiral Hipper, as well as a number of destroyers, had split off to cut off the main parts of the convoy, while the 2 fast battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, were to look for any larger British ships. 2 days later, much to their delight, they would find a gigantic, unarmored, and unprotected aircraft carrier just sitting there. That is when Scharnhorst opened fire at Ardent, and also onto Glorious. Within 2 hours, nearly everybody was lost, and the Germans, believing that there would be Allied ships nearby, left without picking up any survivors. As for the battle itself, well, it can't really be called a battle. As there were only 5 ships involved, history does not consider it to be an actual event that can be named, which is likely why that this incident, despite it being so high in the cost of life, is ultimately passed over due to its relative unimportance in the grand scheme of the Second World War. So why was Glorious caught with her, well, flight deck unarmored, or rather unarmed? British intelligence stated that there would be no German forces, but at this point in the war, and even in the First World War, British intelligence, as well as really any naval intelligence, was very, very inaccurate. Cracking the Enigma code for the Nazi regime, and also from the other navies, including the Regia Marine, or even the Imperial Japanese Navy, was extremely difficult, and the technology needed to do so was limited at best. And due to issues from the First World War, namely the Battle of Jutland, a lot of British officers didn't even trust their own intelligence. So even if British intelligence did somehow know that Operation Juno was happening, it is likely that Admiral Hughes would not have heeded it. Again, due to issues of accuracy. I apologize. At 1600, the British would finally spot the German ships, and Ardent would be dispatched to investigate. During this point, the aircraft carrier Glorious did not alter course or increase speed. Instead, 5 aircraft were ordered to go to the flight deck, and by 1620, everyone was ordered to action stations, which, considering that Glorious was moving at a rate of 17 knots, only 3/4 of her speed, and was only defended by 2 destroyers, this is a little strange. Again, nobody really knows why everything was so delayed, or why there was no combat air patrol being flown, or even anybody in the crow's nest to notice that there were any ships nearby. Thus, at 1627, Scharnhorst had opened fire at Ardent, causing the destroyer to withdraw and fire torpedoes while making a smokescreen. Scharnhorst was able to turn away from the torpedoes and then fired at Glorious at 1632, scoring the first hit 6 minutes later on the 3rd salvo. This shot, incidentally, is at a range of nearly 24,000 miles, which is the second longest shot ever in history. Arguably, it is the longest shot in history, though many historians would instead give it to the HMS Warspite a year and a half later for hitting an Italian ship that was moving while Glorious was very, very slow. This hit caused damage to Glorious's aircraft elevator, meaning that the swordfish aircraft that were to be put onto her flight deck could no longer be done so. This meant that Glorious was essentially sitting there, unable to attack back. By 1658, another shell would hit a beacon above the bridge and likely killed or wounded all of the personnel stationed there. With no communications and nothing else, all Glorious could do was sit inside of HMS Ardent's smokescreen and hope that the Germans would leave. As one might imagine, this did not happen. The estimate is that 900 men abandoned Glorious. However, due to the actions of both Ardent and Acosta, who had both dove out of the cover of the smokescreen to try and launch torpedoes, to even some effectiveness, they were both sunk, and Glorious would join them shortly thereafter. Thus, from a total, the total number of survivors, estimating of about 900, would end up going to about 40, including one each from Acosta and Ardent, bringing the total death toll to 1,519 people. This story is interesting to me because if any amount of preparation had been done on the side of the Admiral Guy Jolly Hughes commanding HMS Glorious, perhaps the Germans would have been sighted much, much earlier. This would mean that she would presumably be able to either get out of range or at least convince the Germans that there was more ships waiting. But one thing in particular to note is the two destroyers, Ardent and Acosta. Both withdrawing from their smokescreen and even scoring hits with their guns and torpedoes did enough damage to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to cause them to retreat. This means that all of the Norwegian royal family, the gold, and all of the civilians would end up surviving all the way back to Scapa Flow, as the Germans would later believe that the convoy was way better armored than it actually was. To think that two destroyers, heavily outgunned, decided to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their mission, even though their commanding officer is ultimately the one that got them into this doomed situation, is something that I think needs to be repeated in every history class ever. It's strange. I have personally found myself in a few situations where my actions could greatly alter the outcome of a particular circumstance, but it's difficult, I think. I mean, everybody can say, "Oh, I would gladly take a bullet for you," but the reality of that situation is often quite a bit different. Having to make the decision on whether or not you live or not is a hard one. Having a ship full of people, and if we take the averages of about 160 for each destroyer, that's 320 people that you're just deciding need to be sacrificed because one person decided that they didn't care enough about what's happening. Worse yet, for the next 60 years, and perhaps beyond even that, the Royal Navy decided that the best way to remember this was to just pretend it didn't happen. Or at least shrug your shoulders and say, "Man, what an unfortunate accident." As it so happens, British intelligence wouldn't even know that Glorious had sunk until after the commercial that I had played earlier aired upon German radio. To that end, I would like all of you to know and remember that if ever you need to make a decision, stop and consider things before emotions. Oftentimes, your actions can have some pretty extreme consequences. And while I don't think I would ever compare what one person is doing on a scale like this, making someone else be a hero because of someone's mistake is never a good outcome. Now, in the description of this stream, I have listed a number of links. I would recommend that if you wish to know more about this event and the ships involved, you go to look at them. I had originally thought I would do so myself, but it is considered standard that ships of the Kriegsmarine have the Nazi swastika on both the port and the bow. I didn't really want to censor them for the sake of historical accuracy, but I'm also aware that, well, airing such images and talking about such things is a touchy subject for many involved. So to that end, I have no background or any background music. So the ship was sunk in order to protect the goal. The ship was sunk because of its commanding officer not quite realizing the gravity of the situation, that they're in war. An aircraft carrier is, well, a carrier of aircraft. So when there's no planes to launch off of a deck, how useful do you think that ship is? It isn't. But what's really baffling is that they were traveling at 3/4 speed and with nobody in the crow's nest at all. Not a single person. There's 1,500 crew members. Well, there's 1,200 crew members aboard Glorious, and not a single one had a pair of binoculars looking out for enemy ships, despite going into enemy territory. Again, the reasons why are essentially lost to time. But the few quotes about the Admiral, Guy Diolly Hughes, has been stated that he was very single-minded and extremely short-tempered. It is a common opinion for naval historians to say that Admiral Hughes was so focused on trying to get his air commander court-martialed due to the earlier issues that he just didn't care. Others, again, say that British intelligence said the wrong thing. Others still attempt to argue that Glorious had other problems with her maintenance that forced her crew to be elsewhere. Winston Churchill himself, during a different meeting with Parliament, said that this could not possibly be the case and is utter nonsense, to paraphrase. The important parts to gather here is that Glorious was lost for essentially no reason, and her 2 escorts basically all died trying to protect her. Those escorts were given to her explicitly for the sake of hunting submarines in the case that any U-boat activity was detected. They're not made to fight surface ships. But fight surface ships they did, and Acosta in particular landed 2 torpedoes on Gneisenau's bow, punching a hole large enough that the ship had to return to a French port before completing the rest of Operation Juno. This is what allowed the mission to be done. It had nothing to do with Glorious, who sat there on fire. In fact, Glorious's only notable achievement ever after being converted into an aircraft carrier is that she was a target for the second longest range hit in history, at least from one warship to another. It is a tremendous loss of life that is just kind of barely talked about, because again, it happened very, very quickly, and there were only 5 ships involved. But as I said before, I think that talking about the whole situation through Historiograph's animated feature is one of the best videos to look into, as he has not only an excellent narration, but also little figurines that he moves around to show the specific positions of each ship, where they were at what time, and it helps give a lot of context. I would have done so myself, but I'm not exactly interested in just taking someone else's content. Drakinophil is a naval historiographer for the Royal Navy, and he has ship guides that talk in depth about a ship's construction, its relative history, and how it's generally capable of doing the things that it did. Things like the shot that Scharnhorst made onto Glorious, the torpedoes that Gneisenau took, and other such things can be found on his channel. Both of those individuals, Drakinophil and historiographer respectively, take their work very, very seriously. All of their work is fully cited, and I definitely recommend checking out their channels if this kind of stuff interests you. What I wanted to do is mostly bring to light that this is an event that happened. This wasn't meant to be a big conversation stream, just, I guess you could say, a memorial of sorts. To that end, I think I will be wrapping up shortly. Oh, also, if you are interested, there is a educational upload of the propaganda reel from the Kriegsmarine, uploaded by History Flicks for You, that I have not put in the description. The title of the video is On Board as Battleship KMS Scharnhorst and KMS Gneisenau Sink HMS Glorious in the Second World War. During this, you can watch the whole reel as it is narrated in German, and watch the footage as Scharnhorst opened fired on Glorious. Though, again, I should mention, there's no censorship in this video, as it is a propaganda reel, so do view at your own risk. To that end, I thank you all for coming. I hope to do more things like this, though perhaps in a less somber manner. One thing I definitely want to talk about is everybody's favorite Kriegsmarine vessel, the Bismarck. And perhaps I will do something a little special there. But until then, we shall see.